Hello and welcome back to the Welsh Lady ASMR. Today I am doing another soft-spoken journey back in time through the pages of my Reader's Digest, Yesterday's Britain book. I have already done a few videos from this book, and if you are interested I will link the playlist above and in the description below. Today we are looking at the years from 1939 to 1945. Of course, the years of the Second World War. Now, before I record these videos, I like to read the relevant chapters so that when I'm showing you the book, flicking through the pages, I already know in my mind which bits I want to talk about and the photographs I want to sort of spend time on. And I have just finished reading the chapters for the Second World War, and I must admit I feel very, very sad. I can't even imagine what it was like living at this time, no matter what age, from babies to the elderly, whether you were male or female, and wherever you lived. It was a horrendous time to be alive. I know if I can't get hold of my children for a few hours, I'm beside myself with worry. What it must have been like for the parents whose children were away fighting, and they didn't hear anything for weeks, months. Just agony, absolute agony. But for me, this chapter has been educational and enlightening, just as an overview of the events, at least from the perspective of Great Britain, of those years and the sort of experiences that ordinary people had to go through. So I do hope you find it interesting. Let me know in the comments anyway. I do enjoy reading them. So for now, let's look through the pages of the book. Okay, here we go with our first page. 1939 to 1945, a country goes to war. Here we are looking at from the outbreak of war. People talked about the phony war because there was a year after war was declared where people were being asked to black out, not have any lights showing, and people got a little bit resentful of the blackout. We've got streets and pavements being painted in white because apparently there was a huge increase in road accidents, and the blackout was rigidly enforced by a civilian army of ARP, or Air Raid Precaution Wardens. It reminds me a little bit of the resentment some people felt during lockdowns of the pandemic. People were told to wear something white at night, but by the end of the year, more than 4,000 people had died in blackout accidents. But during the same period, 3 members of the British Expeditionary Force were killed in action. So you can understand the resentment, I suppose. Another tangible sign that Britain was at war was the absence of children from towns and cities. In anticipation of air attacks, Britain began as early as September the 1st evacuating children, pregnant women and other vulnerable people. And this rather cute little trio of children here. Children were tagged, little parcel labels here. They were tagged like parcels and packed off to the relative safety of the countryside. Country dwellers were obliged to take on as many evacuees as they had space for. I just cannot imagine as a parent packing off little children. But I guess if you thought they were going to be safer, you would do it. So here we've got the story of the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. And the army were ferried back from the French port of Dunkirk by the Royal Navy and by a vast fleet of small boats manned by civilians. The people who owned barges, fishing boats, all went across the channel to rescue the soldiers from Dunkirk. The defeated army were greeted back in Britain with cigarettes and sweets, and only Churchill, the new Prime Minister, was inclined to dampen the elation, remarking that wars are not won by evacuation. Anyway, a fortnight later, France surrendered and Britain was left to continue the struggle alone. And then Britain and the Air Force were battling in the skies with the RAF, duelling with the Luftwaffe. But the name of the game changed in September 1940. There was a great flotilla in V formation, and people on the ground heard the scream of the bombs and explosions. The Battle of Britain was over, and the Blitz had just begun. And of course the East End of London was so badly hit. By one night alone, 430 people had been killed and 1,600 seriously wounded. Awful. And we've got here a little article talking about the Home Guard and how men that were, and women I think, who were too old to go to the front line were called into action closer to home. Anthony Eden, the War Minister, made an appeal to the nation on the wireless. He asked for volunteers to put themselves forward for a new fighting force to be known as the Local Defence Volunteers. And within an hour of that broadcast, many men had volunteered themselves. But Churchill renamed this force the Home Guard, and in time they became known as Dad's Army, which of course in the 70s was a very, very popular comedy show on TV, which I know my dad used to love. At first there was very little equipment for these men, who went on patrol with pitchforks, but by the winter of 1940 the Home Guard was properly kitted out with standard issue army uniforms, and most had First World War rifles supplied by the neutral United States. And then we've got, of course, during the Blitz and the bombing campaigns over London, people went for safety at night to underground stations. And this photograph is of children. Obviously they switched the electric off to the rails overnight, and children here sleeping quite happily, it seems, in hammocks strung between the railway tracks. Caption here: underground stations were blast-proof doss houses by night. Blitz Londoners would often bed down on the platforms and elevators before the tube had stopped running. It looks so uncomfy, but I guess it was safer than being on the streets. Look at the destruction here. But this is the spirit of the people. You know, they'd have this awful campaign of bombing during the night. But in the day, people would pick up their things and just go to work. There was a grim determination to be cheerful, a calculated refusal to admit how desperate the situation had become was the living legacy of Dunkirk. Churchill saw it in the spirit of an unquenchable people. And you've got other people then who, trying to avoid bombs and get sleep, was to go every evening to places of relative safety. So as many as 5,000 people camped out in Epping Forest, like latter-day Robin Hoods. And some even went back in time and established the Chislehurst Caves in Kent. So every night people left the capital to go to these Bronze Age homes, living in caves. It's just remarkable, isn't it? Something probably that's not widely known. But to live safer, closer to home, millions were given government-issue do-it-yourself caves to be installed in the back garden. These were the Anderson shelters, and I think there's a photograph here. Yeah, that is an Anderson shelter. It was sort of a hut made of corrugated metal that was supposedly dug down in the ground, banked up with earth all around. And this one has been bombed, but looks as though it's still intact. But not everyone was prepared to fight, and there was a cohort of people known as conscientious objectors who, on moral grounds, refused to take part in the war. I think these people had a hard time of it at the time. Yeah, difficult times for everyone, as I said. But Britain was a fortress island, and it was a nation under siege. Bombing went on relentlessly, and people kind of all wanted to do their bit for victory. And as much as possible, being able to carry on as normal. This is a photograph of Coventry, which is a city in the Midlands, and my great aunt that I have spoken about so much, my great aunt Lil, lived in Rugby at the time, which was only a few miles away from Coventry, and I remember her talking about the absolute devastation. I think the cathedral was literally blown to nothing. And the caption here, Coventry was the first provincial town to feel the weight of a massive Luftwaffe attack. And one commercial traveller who visited the smoking ruins of the city was struck by the resolve of its people. Having got over the initial shock, he said, I think they are now prepared to stand anything. I mean, look at this. Look at the devastation. And women called into duty as the Women's Land Army because, of course, Britain was pretty much under siege. So the government kind of instituted this huge campaign to grow more food. So all public amenity areas were kind of dug and plants and food grown. And the farmers, of course, a lot of the men who had previously worked as farm labourers had been called up and gone overseas. So women were brought in to manage farms. And hard work it was. The first week I thought I dropped dead from tiredness, says Joan Shakeshaft. It was haymaking time. I had 2 or 3 blisters on each finger from using a pitchfork, and when we came in at 5:30 the first day, I could hardly stagger up the stairs to bed. The farmers were first sceptical about the worth of the land girls, but they were glad to have us, says Joan Shakeshaft. There wasn't anything we didn't tackle. We were proud to think we were really doing something worthwhile. Amazing. An advert here for recruiting women to come and join the Women's Land Army. Here we've got pictures of the royal family doing their bit. The Buckingham Palace got bombed several times during the Blitz, and the then King and Queen went to visit communities who'd also been bombed in the East End of London. And then we've got the stately homes who were kind of commissioned to be, well, all sorts of things, from field hospitals to training to billets for the army. And here are 2 examples of stately homes that became boarding schools. And another page on the women in the war. The women were called into factories. I honestly think this is so incredible that women just picked up tools and took on the jobs that had previously only been considered for men. An example here, this lady's working in an aircraft repair shop, and it was seen as a glamorous option for a conscripted woman. Officials reckoned it would take 3 women to do the work of 2 men, but women proved them wrong. Yes, even women were conscripted during the war. In December 1941, conscription was introduced for unmarried women between the ages of 18 and 30. They had the choice of going into the women's services, civil defence or industry. And I know my grandmother wouldn't have been conscripted because she was married with children, but my great aunt Lil was. I don't actually know what she did during the war, but as I said, she was living in the Midlands at the time, so I think she worked in factories. Of course, many women went into the factories making munitions. Dangerous work. They got danger money, but a lot of women kind of were very proud of the work and felt that, they enjoyed the money and the independence. I mean, look at this photograph of this lovely lady here. You had women on the buses, drivers and conductors, and women going into engineering. I mean, why not? We know that now, but then it must have been really, really incredible. Women in the war rooms, civil defence control rooms. But incredibly, the value placed on women in the workplace did not bring them equal pay. Throughout the war, women workers earned considerably less than men. I guess that's a sign of the times people were in. Somebody here says nobody seemed to mind because before the war no one had equal pay anyway. You just accepted it. It was more money than I had ever earned, and it didn't occur to you to complain. But of course, women didn't end their working day when the whistle blew. They went home and had to manage children, shopping, all the other tasks. I love this picture here, smiling through. There was a great camaraderie among the women of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. And one of the duties of ATS recruits was to operate the huge searchlights used to spot and track enemy aircraft. And then here we're looking at the rationing. Must have been so difficult. I mean, living, working, hard, long hours, but not even having really lovely, good, healthy. Well, I say not healthy. I think the food was quite healthy, actually. I think the nation's health improved massively on rationing, but yeah, no treats, chocolate, and the usual things we accept now. It was rations in bacon and ham, sugar, butter, cooking fat, meat, tea, cheese, jam. And then I think rationing expanded into clothing. There was the development of utility clothing, which, you know, basically there was no wastage of material, so trousers had no turn-ups. Clothes didn't have pleats and tucks. Jewellery, it was a utility ring, gold ring for weddings, which was 9 carat, not 22 carat. Even furniture and crockery in the home became utility because the raw materials just weren't around. And women painted colouring on their legs instead because stockings were in such short supply. And exotic fruit, as they were then, such as banana and melons, were just vanished off the streets. A lot of ministries in the UK were advising people on how to make food from very little. People were encouraged to dig up gardens and dig for victory, grow plants, potatoes. People kept pigs. I think communities would club together and all look after a pig. The future promise of bacon sandwiches. Yeah, look, dig for victory. And sort of entertainment for the soldiers on leave. And trying to have as much fun as possible with dance halls, cinema. Always the threat, though, of an air raid. And when the war broke out, cinemas closed down for fear of air raids, but by the end of 1939, nearly all had reopened. If the siren sounded, warnings were given to audiences. Yeah, remnants again of lockdown. The recent lockdown, I mean, where entertainment venues were closed down. And then here we are looking at the, again, we talked about it in the last video, but the radio, a source of news and entertainment for people at home. And again, the BBC, people tuning in to listen to the war reports, and the newsreaders quickly became celebrities. Yeah, you can just imagine the family like here just gathering around the wireless for news of loved ones overseas, just desperate for every little snippet of news. And again, I know I keep talking about the lockdown, but I know me and my family used to gather around the TV in the early days of the very first lockdown and wait for Boris and Rishi and all the medical officers to come and tell us the news about COVID. Kind of, you're just desperate for news and reassurance, aren't you? And you know, popular songs at the time, Vera Lynn, Force's Sweetheart, singing about the white cliffs of Dover. Of course, Winston Churchill, who I suppose epitomises the spirit, the British bulldog spirit. I take up my task with buoyancy and hope, said Churchill on his first day as Britain's war leader. Yeah. And here we're looking at romance during the war, and weddings shot up in number at the start of the war. I think probably young people just kind of, I guess you didn't know what was going to happen in the future. So just people just got married. And then there's the goodbyes at the train stations. Horrible, horrible times for everyone. And even if you were a mother with young children, you just didn't know, a few days leave here and there. So these guys were coming home to children they barely knew. And here now we're talking about the liberation of Europe. Once that began, people dared to believe that the end was in sight. But before that, there was one last terror to be born before peace. And that, this article goes on to the unmanned bombs, the doodlebugs. So these doodlebugs, horror. And then later, the V2 rockets came that travelled faster than the speed of sound, so you didn't even hear those coming. The screaming whoosh of its arrival really followed after the impact. Oh, it just doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Doesn't bear thinking about. But eventually, peace. And the celebrations when peace was announced. Streets of London came alive when news broke that the war was over. Look at these happy faces. How incredible. Must have been after all those years. Imagine. 6 years. And we're on the timeline here, so let's pick out a few little interesting dates. 1939 September. Neville Chamberlain announces that Britain is at war with Germany. During the same year, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz and Wuthering Heights come out in the cinema. 1940 January. Sugar, butter and bacon are rationed. June, the last British troops are evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. Paris falls as Italy declares war on Britain and France. By July, Britain braces herself for invasion. In December of 1940, the City of London suffers a massive air raid in which 8 Wren churches are destroyed. But books and plays are still published. For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog by Dylan Thomas. 1941 January, British forces push back the Italian army in North Africa. Amy Johnson, flying pioneer, goes missing. May, the German warship Bismarck is sunk by the Royal Navy. June, Germany invades Russia, violating the Mutual Non-Aggressive Pact. Rationing of clothes begins in Britain. 1942. Britain suffered its worst shipping losses of the war so far. I know my grandmother's cousin, I think it was in the Merchant Navy. And I know my grandmother was very, very upset. I think they were quite close. He died when his ship was sunk by a U-boat. So, yeah, just imagine all the supplies. People in the Merchant Navy bringing supplies. It was so dangerous. In June 1942, utility is launched as designers are asked to produce smart but economical fashions. 1943 in January. 1943 in March, people rushed to take shelter from an air raid in Bethnal Green tube station. Someone trips on the escalator, and in a tragic domino effect, 178 people are killed. I didn't know anything about that. And September 1943, the Allies invade the Italian mainland and Italy surrenders. 1944, non-war news. In February, Pay As You Earn begins. Let's have a look. In May, forces gather in Britain for the invasion of Europe. And in June, Allied forces launch the largest seaborne invasion in history against German-occupied France, and American troops enter Rome. Germany bombards Britain with V-1 rockets. Those are the doodlebugs. Photograph here. Of course, there was that film. Was so emotional, wasn't it? The Saving Private Ryan. But American troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The opening few minutes of that film. 1945, Allies crossed the Rhine into Germany. In April, American and Soviet troops meet on the Elbe. Mussolini is captured by Italian partisans and shot, and Hitler commits suicide in his underground bunker. In May, Germany surrenders. May the 8th is declared VE Day. And in August, August the 15th is declared VJ Day. The Second World War is over. But not before. USA drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, then another on Nagasaki. Horrendous, horrendous. Yeah, so very, very sobering chapter. It doesn't feel terribly ASMR today, but yeah, it is history. Next time, I hope you'll join me. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't. Next video, we are looking at 1945 to 49. The austerity years, yes, even after the war. I know my mother talks about this. It was a long, long time before food rationing and clothes rationing stopped. It was a very, very tough time. So yeah, please join me in the next video. See you next time.